Welcome to the Balancing Act podcast. I'm Andy Temte. Today we've got Mr. Andrew Rosen joining us, also known as Andy. We worked together at Kaplan for many years, and when we had more than there were more of us that had the name Andy in the room, and it was a lot of fun having multiple Andys in the room. Anyway, Andy's my former boss and is the chairman and chief executive officer of the global education giant Kaplan Incorporated. Thank you so much for being here, Andy.
Andy, great to be here. It's always fun to be with you. In fact, look, I've been at Kaplan for a long time. One of the key reasons I'm there is because I got to work with people like you, smart, passionate, focused. I mean, that's one of the real pleasures of my life is to spend time with the team that we have at Kaplan, and you were, one of the key leaders of that team.
Yeah, it is an extraordinary place with just, a lot of businesses are like this. A lot of businesses have that built-in purpose. We had it in spades at Kaplan, helping individuals achieve their educational and career goals, one success story at a time. That's how you know how long I worked there. It just rolls right off the tongue. But a lot of businesses, when you dig underneath, they do have that and have those extraordinary people. But I agree. We were just so fortunate to have that built in.
What you're dealing with at Kaplan is an aspirational group of customers. By definition, every single person you're dealing with is trying to get to the next level. They're trying to get into a better school. Succeed on a licensure exam, get a degree. Like that's a really appealing population to serve, and it's part of what attracts such great people to help work with all of us.
Yeah, that's right. So today we're gathered together in our fifth episode in our mini series entitled "Nobody Wants to Think Anymore," which is an exploration of the often misunderstood skill of critical thinking. I wanted to do this series after hearing on multiple occasions, just kind of out in the wild, people grousing about nobody wants to work anymore, and then extending that into nobody wants to think anymore, to really peel apart this higher order skill of critical thinking. But before we get started, as always, I want to ask you tell our listeners your story. Give us some insight into Andy Rosen.
Well, I guess, depending on where I want to start the story, I was a lawyer for first the Washington Post newspaper and then for Newsweek. And I thought those were great jobs for a lawyer. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the organizations I was part of. But I started to feel that, I was working in a zero-sum game. That is, a lot of lawyering is about trying to pull value onto your side of the table as opposed to the other guy's, part of the table. And I really wanted to grow the pie instead of just allocating the pie. And the other thing was, I was always working in support of somebody else. That is, if I were reviewing an article for publication to be sure it didn't have any problems, I'm working on somebody else's article. If I'm working on a deal, I'm working on somebody else's deal. And I felt over time that I think I'm capable of being the primary, of creating value myself. So I started to want to move away from just working on behalf of others or allocating the size of the pie, and towards building and growing things. And so I started looking around at other opportunities, and I came across a guy that, Andy, you know well, Jonathan Grayer, who was at Newsweek at the time, and he was considering moving over to Kaplan. He had been asked to move over to Kaplan, which at the time was a money-losing, shrinking, low-quality test prep firm. And he had been asked to come over and sort of help rebuild that. And as he and I were talking about whether he should go, he said, well, look, if I go, you got to come with me. And I thought, maybe it would be interesting. It was clearly an undermanaged business. And so anyway, Jonathan persuaded me to come aboard, and he was my friend and mentor throughout the first 20 years or so of my time at, well, not quite that, 17 years of my time at Kaplan. He became the CEO. I became the president. But I came to Kaplan running a test prep center, and then ran a region, and then ran the field operations, and ultimately became chief operating officer and president as Kaplan grew beyond test prep into the professional business that you ran, Andy, our international business, and so on. So I guess that's the heart of the story.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit later about Kaplan, but a lot of people still have it in their minds that Kaplan is an SAT or a GMAT prep business, and just the sheer global scale of the business is quite extraordinary from those roots that you just described when you and Jonathan took over. Back in the very early 1990s, I always loved hearing you and Jonathan after I joined in 1999 talk about the stories of, if we just had more computers, everything would be fine. If we just added a few more desktop computers, everything would be great. And how that technology trap was. You clearly broke out of the technology trap now into this global business.
Yeah, there's a lot of you always want to try the easy solutions first, and it's only when they don't work that you got to think more holistically about what the issues are.
Right. So back to your story. If you had to pick one thing that just put rocket boosters under your career, that key tipping point, that accelerant for your career, what would that have been?
Well, yeah, I feel like there are a lot of things I could choose, but I probably would go back to that relationship with Jonathan, because I think coming over to Kaplan, and he was a great mentor to me. I would have moved into business somewhere else, but I ended up coming into a company that had that was, as I said, undermanaged. It had great opportunity. It had a much more resilient brand than I expected, and it had the kind of mission that we've already talked about. And that was really a blessing to come into that world. And I would say that Jonathan, who was a very ambitious, fast-moving, very, very brilliant guy, was an excellent person. I learned a lot because I'd been a lawyer. Jonathan was MBA and so on. And I think that we blended well together, and I learned a lot from him.
Yeah, it's that finding those people where your skill sets augment one another. And opposites attract for a reason, and I enjoy it. I like that about the Jonathan and Andy story, and how you guys work together along with the rest of that team. It wasn't
just a Jonathan and Andy story. It was John Polstein, whom I know you had on the show, Melissa Mack, Robert Greenberg. I mean, there's a whole group of people who together sort of took on their shoulders the task of dragging Kaplan out of the hole it was in and putting it, bringing it forward into the much bigger and broader company that it is now.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about critical thinking, let our listeners know what critical thinking means to you.
Well, I mean, I view it as really sort of analyzing and synthesizing, available facts, data, evidence, counter evidence, observations, arguments, to form a judgment. So, and that is pulling together information that is relevant to a judgment instead of just making a judgment, which is what happened. The title of your segment refers to that, and it's not just that people make judgments without thinking; they make judgments based on they outsource their thinking.
Right.
To somebody else. They say, you know what, if I read something on Facebook, I know lots of people who get outraged when they see a headline on Facebook, and they don't even take the time to say, is this real? Like, is it from a legitimate source? Is there anything that I should believe in this? But they allow themselves to get upset by something that they just, they hear without digging deeper into it. And of course, I'm sure we don't want to get into a political discussion, but throughout our politics right now, people are expected to follow whatever, if you like Obama, then anything Obama says is right, and anything, if you don't like him, whatever he says is wrong. And then when Trump becomes president, the reverse is true. The same people, and without going to the underlying merits of the arguments, and that I think has frustrated. It's frustrated pretty much everybody, and it's kind of undermined our politics because people are not doing their own work to understand what it is that they want and saying, I want to support outcomes and not just the people who we think tend to agree with us.
Yeah, yes. The answer to your question, yes, we're not going to talk about politics today, but we kind of are, because that phrase that you used, outsourcing our thinking, I think that's going to be one of the many real quotable moments that come out of this discussion. And yeah, this, giving one's opinion to someone else without really thinking deeply about it. I make no qualms about wanting to bring the world back closer to center. In my YouTube video message from last weekend, I call myself a pale blue daughter. We're on this planet all together. We've got one spaceship. Why are we ripping each other apart with this hyper-partisanship? And critical thinking just seems to be lost in the equation.
Yeah, but outsourcing your thinking, it makes sense for some. If you think about the human beings, like each person didn't have to decide for themselves that a given berry was poisonous,
right? Or
to avoid the lions. There are certain things that you're told by people that you trust, and you believe it. And, so over time, it would be impossible for all of us to do all the thinking on every issue. Yeah. I mean, nowadays, the questions are, surround like vaccines and things like that. Like at some point you have to outsource your thinking to people you trust, but you should apply your critical thinking as to whether they are people you should trust.
Right.
And you'll be right sometimes, you'll be wrong sometimes, but we can't validate for ourselves the evidence behind everything surrounding us, or we'd be completely paralyzed. It's inherent in who we are as humans that we have to trust some things to be true, but sometimes it feels like we're going a little too far towards trust and believing, and we got to do our own work.
It's a balancing act, is it not?
Maybe that would be the way to say it. It's a balancing. I think you got it.
It's just such an easy softball plug for my book, isn't it?
Well, the fact is, much of life is a balancing act, and your book, which, as an aside, is a wonderful book. If people in the audience haven't read it, I truly encourage it. I learned a lot. I feel like I became a better manager, better person from reading it. But that notion of balancing act pervades our life.
Yeah, that's my cue for an aw shucks moment. So let's move on a little bit here. Can you tell us a story or two about a time in your career when critical thinking was just absolutely essential to a success, or better told, the avoidance of a failure?
Well, of course, you like to think that a lot of your, hopefully most of your decisions are based on critical thinking. So hopefully that's, I don't have to dig too deep to find a decision that was based on critical thinking. But one good example I would say is for years I gave I would give talks in various forums, talk about how the combination of demographics and the use of technology to enable consolidation would lead, maybe as many as half of American higher education institutions to become non-viable over the next 20 years. That a lot of institutions, there are going to be some institutions that are going to get bigger, and there's some that just are not going to be able to attract students, and they're going to go away. When I gave that talk, I'd usually say, there's about 150 institutions around the country that you could pretty much put in the survivor category. They would have to have cataclysmic failures to not make it in. But who among the other 850 institutions, among the 4,000 institutions that exist, would make it into the remaining 85% there is to be determined. As I was giving those talks, we had this institution, Kaplan University, and there were a bunch of reasons to think that Kaplan University should be a survivor. Had great outcomes, graduation rates doubled the rest of American higher education for the kinds of students it serves. The students were getting jobs at very high rates, making more money. They were very happy about the experience. All those things would suggest here's an institution that should be a survivor. But, thinking, you applying a critical thinking approach, it was a relatively new institution, founded in 2000, for-profit institution at a time when, people are inherently skeptical of for-profits, a high-performing for-profit. We used to say it was a beautiful house in a lousy neighborhood, but people still made judgments about it, forced us to think, what should we do about this set of capabilities and this institution? And it led us to think that it would be better off as part of a more established institution. And that's what led to our sale of Kaplan University to Purdue University. By the way, Purdue at the time, as Mitch Daniels has described, was going through its own exercise of saying, hey, we want to serve the adult population. We want to be stronger online, but we don't really have the capabilities in-house to do that. And so when we started talking with Purdue, it was sort of a hand-in-glove solution. Not an easy one for us because we had to give up, we sold the institution, we gave up control of something we loved. It was our baby, but it was the analytic process to not just keep on doing the same thing we've been doing and assume that all will work out, but to say, maybe we have to do something very hard for us to do what's right for the students, the alumni, and the employees and society. So that's what we did. And I think that that was very much a critical thinking exercise of going through all of the data and evidence and, arguments and projections that, what would be the best home for what was then Kaplan University and is now Purdue Global.
Yeah, I'm glad you told that story because that is the perfect example of where, from a critical thinking perspective, you have a very difficult problem or challenge to solve, and you just kind of have to step back as your own third party, looking at the issue from lots of different angles. Kaplan University was homegrown within the organization, lots of personal passion-based attachments, and it could have, in many other business environments, with decision makers maybe with weaker egos or less critical thinking skills, might have taken that in a different direction and would have had a very different ending. So a lot of people listening to this, they aspire to be in your chair one day, not your specific chair, but the chair of the chief executive officer of a business. How, speaking to those individuals, how do you apply critical thinking in your day-to-day, what I like to call leader standard work? Or said differently, what does critical thinking look like in action at the senior executive level?
Well, let me put aside the leader standard for a second and just talk about culture. we have we sometimes describe the culture at Kaplan that nobody will ever stab you in the back at Kaplan, but that doesn't mean they won't go after you. And the concept there is not that that you want people to be passive with one another, but they should do it directly. If you've got an argument with somebody, raise it with them. Don't walk away because they might be offended or whatever. Like we should have it on. There should be a rough and tumble, but it should be done respectfully and it should be done directly. So, sometimes when people come to me and say, "Boy, that was a dumb argument, dumb point that so and so made in that meeting," I will always say first, "Well, what did so and so say when you told them that?" And if they say, "Well, I didn't tell them that," then I'm like, I don't want to hear. I want you to, if you disagree with somebody, don't go around their back. Don't tell me. Tell them. And by the way, this is at Kaplan, this is very much throughout the organization. I would say, if Andy, when we work together, if there are times when I'm raising questions with you, there are at least as many times when you're raising questions with me about how, priorities for the company, how things ought to work, how things ought to be organized, because, I have to assume, felt empowered to push that agenda. And, sometimes I would agree with you. Sometimes I would disagree with you. Sometimes I would disagree with you. And then much later, sometimes years later, agree with you. But what you want is to encourage an environment in which that people are pushing each other and not just saying, well, this is the way it goes. That's the way we do things. When you talk about, as I understand, sort of leader standard work, we do have a series of sort of a cadence of meetings and reviews and things like that are regular. So obviously we have financial reviews on a depending on the unit on a either monthly or quarterly basis, and then obviously budgets and so on. And in those meetings, like in the regular day-to-day conversations, things sometimes can be just fine. We're doing okay and fell a little short here, but when you get to those, let's say, quarterly reviews, you dig into whether things are really fine. You go step by step and understand every lever within the business. And doing so, if you don't have a standardized cadence of that, you can miss things. And by the way, we do that for financial reviews at Kaplan. We also do it we do learning reviews. So, and this is actually quite unusual in the education world, but twice a year, we will go through in depth what the learning achievements are. Like that is, like we've already established, what is it that students want out of our program, and how are they doing in getting that, and what is our strategy for continuously improving that. And so we'll start the meetings talking about, well, here's what you said you're going to do. How have you accomplished? How far have you gone on that? Have you reached your goals, and how do we extend that? And so you can do it. These are not just financial metrics that you can build things around. Whatever your company is focused on and what your customer is focused on, make sure that you're achieving those goals as well. Because in the long run, your company is not going to be successful unless your customers are successful.
Yeah, and walking into those sessions with an open mind and being able to look at things from multiple directions instead of, well, we've always done it this way, and that's.
But the result, and the results, I wouldn't say they speak for themselves, but they are what they are, and if they're not what you want them to be, then there's something that you need to do in order to put them in that role. One of the other things I should just add is that I've been in lots of meetings where there's lots of questioning, but it is in a gotcha environment. Like, you missed this. Well, that doesn't lead to trust. That doesn't lead to a feeling of openness. If the purpose, if you and I, if you're running a unit and I'm overseeing, we're aligned. There's nothing. If you have a problem, I have a problem. So let's figure it out together.
Right.
And the question should be designed not to show, oh, I'm smarter than this guy, or she made this mistake. It's how do we solve the underlying issues of the business? How do we make sure that we're that we're making progress. And that culture has to be, I think for critical thinking to permeate the organization, there has to be the trust that the reason that you're asking questions is to improve the business and help everyone.
Yeah, that internal competition that it can be very unhelpful, especially when it's framed in that got you type of an environment. The emotional waste, there's just so much waste that is that's generated by that. So, for our listeners, thank you for going there, and thank you for making that clarification. I want to switch gears just a little bit here. You've got a lot of experience in higher education. I trace our challenges with critical thinking back into our K-12 systems and the preparedness that of students that we're sending into our institutions of higher learning of various varieties. What advice do you have for educators and business leaders as an extension to move the needle on what, for lack of better terminology, we'll call critical thinking literacy?
Yeah, well, let me add another constituency there, which is parents.
Yeah,
because there's research that says that infants have are able to think critically. Really, it's very impressive how very, very young children can figure out where something doesn't make sense, and they use whatever means they have to try to figure out what went wrong. Peekaboo is a version of that. Wait, this is not the way it's supposed to be. So, what you want to do is encourage right from the beginning, encourage children to ask questions and to understand what's behind what they're seeing. One of the things that I would say as a parent, it's hard to say you can never do this, but the because I said so argument. I mean, we've all done it, right? I mean, it's very hard when your kid asks for the 10th time. I don't want to go to sleep now. I want to be 10 minutes. You got to go to bed. Why? It's every time when you're exhausted and the kid is exhausted, to say, well, the importance of sleep to health, or you're going to be tired for preschool in the morning, or mommy and daddy want to watch a movie, whatever the answer. Sometimes it is because I said so, but every time you do it, you should understand that what you're saying to your child is that they should blindly follow a rule without wondering what's behind it. And what you want to do as a parent, as a teacher, as a business leader, is constantly ensure that your people are understanding both the rule and the reason for the rule, and encourage them to ask questions about those rules. And questions, by the way, are not just about like the what, but also about motivation. And this is where when somebody says we ought to do it this way, you should always just at least understand that, like sometimes people encourage something that is in both their interest and the organization's interest. It happens all the time. But sometimes they encourage things that are in their interest and not in the organization's interest. And it is useful to know what is in their interest. So what kind of motivations an individual might have for making an argument, not because it means that they're wrong, but just because it might lead you to say, I want to make a couple of additional inquiries. So, I guess I think that whatever role we're in can play a role in encouraging, more questions. And by the way, you mentioned, the education industry. I feel like the education industry is, ironically, because they're supposed to be teaching us about things like critical thinking, as an industry, is guilty of very little critical thinking, or surprisingly little critical thinking. I kind of feel like in the, I don't know when it was. I've always wanted to research this, but in the 30s or 40s or 50s, 1900s, higher education decided that its model was perfect.
Yeah.
That a great professor in front of a room with students and over a 13-week period. And like, was just the height of learning. It could never be better. And one of the problems with that is that it means that anything different is necessarily worse. And so it is possible within education to attack anything, any innovation, as worse because it's different from what has been defined as perfection. And so the result of that is that education moves much more slowly than the rest of the economy. And we're still stuck with models that really don't work as much anymore. And I think that what we're starting to see in higher education is that institutions that have challenged the model are starting finally to get some traction. Arizona State would be a good example of an institution that said, you know what, our job is to further the economy of the state of Arizona, to serve people regardless of their backgrounds, and to, make the university look like the state and so on. And they've been one of the best performing institutions in the country. I would say Purdue falls in that same category. It was that openness, that critical thinking, that made them open to the purchase of Kaplan University.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Education does unfortunately move very, very slowly. I'm still having conversations with educators about new models for entry into the world of work, and the degree is the only recommended path in those educators' opinions. There just is very little willingness to look at alternatives that provide more access and a faster path into earning and blending earning and learning together. So, thank you for leading us there. So, you're a lawyer turned executive. It's a very interesting part of your background, and we'll have some young lawyers, early career lawyers, listening to this, looking to transition into the business world. What are the key skills that lawyers develop during their training that are beneficial to that transition, and what are some that are detrimental?
Well, the legal education process is very much a critical thinking focused process. So the Socratic method that even non-lawyers are familiar with from movies and things like that, where a professor stands in front of a class and starts to put out hypotheticals and gradually say, well, what happens if what if this were the case? What if the car was going 50 miles an hour? What if the car was and just change it and forces people to say, what underlies my assumption about what should be done here? Like that process really trains people to think critically. In fact, anybody in your audience who's ever lived with a law student knows that they're insufferable because they start to question everything. It is exactly the critical thinking process, and it's kind of critical thinking run amok, because you start to challenge, why should peanut butter go with jelly? Everything is up for debate, and so overall, I mean, lawyers have to reel themselves back, and most of them do at some point from that. But it may be other than, I suppose, schools of logic, law schools may be the most sharp trainers in critical thinking in our society, and that's all. That for that reason, I think a law school can be a very good preparation for business. Having said that, on a sort of a relative basis, I would say that lawyers are trained to protect, and business people are trained to grow and build. And you want to get a blend of that. Like, both are very important, but if you're a lawyer and you bring your purely protective sort of modality to the business world, you may end up slowing things down. And so there's some people who are built to grow. things. And there's some people who are built to protect things. And of course, these are learnable tasks. But you should, if you're a lawyer who's thinking to go into business, you want to at least be aware of that, about how you've been trained, so that you can work around it. Like, you don't want to jettison the protective. Like, gosh, I would hate to be, running a big business without really good lawyers who can, point out to you, hey, you know what? If we do that, there's an issue here. So, by all means, it is essential to have excellence in the legal function. But when you find a company that is driven by the lawyers, acting as lawyers, that's a company that is going to have trouble. Oftentimes, have trouble really growing, because they're so worried about doing something wrong that they don't take any risk.
Right. Well, thank you for that, for the young lawyers out there. So we're almost at time here. I'd like to pick your brain just a little bit on where Kaplan is going and how it will use its global standing and reputation as a force for growth and change in the education landscape.
Well, gosh, a lot there. Years ago, I wrote my book more than a decade ago, and I predicted at that time that the future of education was going to be more mobile, more personalized, more outcomes focused, more accessible, and more global. And I think that we, in fact, have seen a lot of that over the last 10 years. And Kaplan has been built around those assumptions about where the world is going. And I feel like, particularly coming out of the pandemic, the world is moving towards Kaplan, towards our approach, towards more practical education, more outcomes-focused education, affordable education. And so, and we've been among the pioneers of that. I mean, one of the little noted, comments coming out of the pandemic was that when we and a small number of other organizations, mostly companies, started pioneering online education back in the 1990s, we were under withering fire. I mean, everybody thought, this is terrible. How could you deliver, education via computer? This is terrible. Even Supreme Court justices weighed in on this, because we had an online law school back in the 1990s, and that was viewed as like an outrage. Well, over time, we and others, were hardly the only innovators here, but started building sophisticated models and technologies and processes and cultures to deliver high quality education. And the rest of American education, and ultimately world education, started the process of following it. And thank goodness all that happened, because if we hadn't been doing that, for all those years, when the pandemic hit and all of a sudden everybody got shifted to online learning, there wouldn't be models and technologies and so on to draw upon. And you could have had the complete collapse of the education system around the world. So I feel like Kaplan has long been driving the process of sort of the future of education, work readiness, which I know is something that is at the heart of what you do, something what you were working on in Kaplan, making sure that students in whatever program they're in, emerge better able to succeed in the workplace on day one. That element of education is something that we have helped pioneer and are continuing to help pioneer, and we will continue to do those kinds of things over time. I think that's, I am the most biased person probably could get on this topic, but Kaplan has been very important to the evolution of education in America and around the world. So I could go in much more detail, but I think it sounds like we're coming towards the end here.
Yeah. No, you and I could have this talk for probably another 2 hours. Andy, thank you so much for being here. This was just a blast to have you on the show. We'll have to do it again. My name is Andy Temte. My guest is Andy Rosen. This is the Balancing Act podcast. Please like, subscribe, rate, share with your friends, and we will see you next time.